The smell hit me before the hatch finished cycling. Wet clay on the edge of going anaerobic. Underneath that, the faint acetone note of ethylene stress ripening in the dark, which meant something in the canopy layer was dying faster than the monitoring team knew. And below both of those, the one I hadn't expected, petrichor, not the comfortable kind that follows a good rain. The scorched, mineral version, the kind that rises off soil when the microbiome has collapsed and the rain has nothing to react with anymore. I stood in the airlock and breathed it in for 3 full seconds while the inner seal finished its pressure check. The monitoring board's briefing had said the vault was experiencing localized species stress events consistent with third-stage environmental compartment cycling. That was their language. In field language, the chamber was sick, had been sick for a while. The ethylene alone told me it had been sick for at least 6 days before I ever arrived. I stepped through. The Varath-Salyun Institute of Applied Ecology occupied the equatorial ring of a station roughly the diameter of a mid-sized city, and the propagation laboratory was its crown. 8 sealed biome vaults, each roughly 4 kilometers across and 2 kilometers high, each one a controlled reproduction of a particular planetary ecosystem. They used them for species recovery certification trials, for graduate research, for the kind of precision ecological work that required a sealed, observable environment and a monitoring team behind a pane of glass who could see everything you did and stop the trial if it went dangerously wrong. The Tier 3 certification trial was the program's hardest. 6 days, sealed inside a compromised biome vault. No sensor arrays of your own, the Institute's equipment stayed on their side of the glass. Your job was to identify every active species stress event in the chamber, document the cascade relationships, propose a recovery intervention for each one, and carry out the interventions using only what the biome itself provided. No supplemental materials. No communications with the board except through the written drop slot in the exit hatch. You passed if you stabilized at least 70% of the active stress events before the end of day 6, and your documentation held up to peer review. 4 candidates were already inside when I arrived, all Varath, all credentialed. The briefing documents had given me their backgrounds in the dry, taxonomic style the Institute used for everything. Researcher Velhoth, 12 years in aquatic recovery. Senior candidate Soralim, 9 years in atmospheric biome consultation. Candidate Dale, terrestrial generalist with a focus on fungal network restoration. Junior candidate Thraxis, 5 years, specialization unclear from the records. They had entered on day 1. I was entering on day 2, delayed by a paperwork correction that had taken the administrative division 48 hours to resolve. The paperwork correction was the reason I was in the vault at all. My official enrollment at Varath-Salyun was what the Institute Student Services Office called an Audit Concurrent Research Placement, a courtesy designation for researchers from non-member species who had expressed interest in the Institute's methodology. I had expressed interest. The Institute's methodology division had reviewed my credentials, decided my 18 years of field survey work in the Andean Pacific Corridor did not map onto any of their standard research tracks, and offered me the audit placement as a compromise that required no one to formally categorize what I was. The audit placement entitled me to observe, to attend non-restricted seminars, to submit written research summaries for advisory comment. It did not entitle me to participate in certification trials. The error, as best anyone could reconstruct it, had originated in the certification board's filing system. Someone on the administrative staff, no one ever identified who, had processed my placement documentation through the Tier 3 enrollment queue rather than the audit observation queue, and by the time the error surfaced I had already been issued a vault entry credential and a standard candidate brief. The administrative division had spent a day and a half trying to unwind the paperwork and concluded that unwinding it would take longer than letting the trial proceed. They issued a corrected placement annotation that formally designated me as an observation concurrent audit participant, which was a category they appeared to have created specifically for this situation, and they sent someone to explain to me in careful detail that my presence in the vault was observational in nature. "You are welcome to document what you observe," the administrative liaison, a Varath named Korath Selm, had told me. She was roughly 2 meters tall, bilateral symmetry, her secondary limbs folded in the formal neutral position I had come to understand was the Institute's equivalent of a patient expression. "You may interact with the biome environment as needed for your own safety. But you should understand that your observations will carry no certification weight, as the audit placement does not grant you standing in the trial record. You are there to watch." "Understood," I told her. She had held the formal neutral posture for a moment longer, as if waiting for me to ask something, then filed my entry credential and sent me to the staging corridor. What I had not told Korath Selm, because she had not asked, was that I had spent the previous 18 years doing field work in environments that were considerably less controlled than a 4-kilometer sealed biome. I had surveyed degraded soil corridors in the Atacama Fringe. I had spent 11 months mapping wild seed populations in the elevated dry forests of the Central Andes, working in sections where the nearest communications relay was 3 days' travel out. I had done 2 seasons in the Pacific coastal strip, where the marine fog layer had retreated far enough that the coastal scrub was dying from the roots up, trying to identify which of the remaining anchor species were still viable, and which were already functionally dead before they showed it in their canopy. None of that was in my enrollment file because none of it translated into the Institute's credential taxonomy. The taxonomy required laboratory hours, certified instrument time, peer-reviewed publications in recognized journals. What I had were field notebooks, 17 of them, numbered in order, the handwriting getting smaller and more compressed as the years went on because I kept running out of pages. I stepped through the inner seal, and the hatch cycled shut behind me. The vault's light cycle was simulating late morning when I entered. The canopy was about 30 meters high, dense, closed, the kind of layering that told you this was meant to be a mature secondary forest ecosystem. The floor was mixed, open soil sections between ground cover colonies, a stream trace that had dropped below its banks and was running about 60% of its normal volume. I could see that from 30 meters away by the color of the streambed sediment. The pale, chalky band above the current waterline was too wide, and the gradient from wet to dry was too abrupt, which meant the drop had been recent and fast rather than gradual. I did not go to the stream first. I went to the closest section of exposed soil and crouched down. The smell was worse up close. I pressed 2 fingers into the topsoil and felt the texture dry on the surface, as expected, but the layer break was too shallow. I went down about 4 centimeters, and the soil went from dry to wet in the space of half a finger width, which meant the capillary movement had stopped. The microbiome that drove capillary moisture movement was either dead or dormant, and the water table below was still present but inaccessible to the root systems above. I sat back on my heels and looked at the canopy. From underneath, the canopy looked fine, but I was looking for the specific pattern of overholding, the way a canopy closes down and stiffens its stomatal exchange when the soil moisture is inaccessible and the root system is running on stored reserves. You couldn't see it in the individual leaves unless you were looking for it and knew what you were looking for. You could see it in the aggregate shape of the canopy layer, the way certain tree crowns had pulled their outer growth slightly inward, not visibly drooping but subtly dense, like a hand that's closed halfway without making a fist. About 40% of the canopy was doing it. I pulled my field notebook out of my vest pocket and wrote, Day 1 for me, Day 2 for trial. Topsoil capillary break, estimated onset for 6 days. Canopy stress presentation approximately 40%, consistent with mid-stage root reserve drawdown. Stream volume approximately 60% of design flow. Ethylene signal on entry. Recommend checking canopy layer for prenecrotic individuals within first 6 hours. I stood up and started walking. I found the 4 candidates about 40 minutes in, working a cluster of what the Institute's biome documentation called Foundation Species 7, large diameter trees, that anchored the mycorrhizal network across roughly a third of the vault floor. They were using the Institute's standard field methodology for network assessment. Surface probes, atmospheric sampling rigs they'd assembled from the biome's permitted material cache, a set of soil core extraction tools that were technically within the trial parameters, but that I'd have called invasive in any field context. Velhoth, the aquatic specialist, was running the atmospheric rig. She was tall even by Verath standards, long-limbed, the kind of build that moved efficiently in enclosed spaces. She looked up when I came through the undergrowth and did the Verath equivalent of a double take, a brief lateral shift of her secondary eye facets before she reoriented. "You are the human," she said. "Tamaz raised," I said. "Audit placement I'm observing." Saralim, who was working one of the soil core tools, did not look up. "The administrative error," she said. "It wasn't hostile exactly, more in the tone of someone making a note in a column." "That's the one," I said. Dale, the fungal specialist, did look up. He was shorter than the others, broader, with a different limb configuration. I hadn't fully catalogued the subspecies distinctions among Verath yet, but the structural variation was significant enough that I suspected Dale and the others were not the same variety of Verath. The way a Siberian and a Bengalese are both human, but built for different ambient conditions. He studied me for a moment with the flat, patient attention that I had come to read as genuine interest rather than suspicion. "You have soil on your fingers," he said. "I stopped to check the topsoil about half a kilometer west," I said. "Capillary layers broken, has been for a while." There was a short silence. "We are aware of the soil moisture event," Saralim said, still not looking up. "It is logged as stress event 4 in our preliminary assessment. We are currently prioritizing the mycorrhizal network mapping before addressing moisture distribution." I didn't say anything to that. The mycorrhizal network mapping was reasonable methodology in a laboratory context. In a field context, with the canopy already at 40% stress presentation and the capillary layer broken for the better part of a week, I would have called it the wrong order of operations. But I wasn't there to critique their methodology. I was there to observe. "What's the stream situation?" I asked. Velhoth answered. "Inflow reduction from the source tributary. We have logged it as stress event 2. The aquatic component is currently stable at reduced flow, though 3 bottom-feeding species are showing behavioral crowding consistent with habitat compression." "How long has the inflow been down?" "Estimated 3 to 4 days, based on sediment banding." The sediment banding I'd read as recent and fast rather than gradual, 3 to 4 days for them, which matched my initial read. "Thanks," I said. "I'll stay out of your work zone. Good luck with the network mapping." Dale watched me leave. I could feel it without turning around. I spent the rest of the first day, my first day, their second, walking the vault. Not systematically, not on a grid. The way I'd learned to walk a degraded field site, following what the environment was telling me, moving toward the signals and stopping when something shifted. By mid-afternoon, I had identified 14 active stress events on my own. The Institute's monitoring board, I would later learn, had logged 11 at that point, and their instruments were still flagging 2 of those as probable rather than confirmed. The sequence that the environment was telling me was this. The stream inflow had dropped first, probably a mechanical issue in the vault's water management system, rather than an ecological failure in the simulation. The reduced inflow had lowered the water table across the eastern third of the vault faster than the drainage gradient could compensate. The capillary break in the topsoil was a downstream consequence of the table drop, not an independent event. And the capillary break was the real problem, because the mycorrhizal network that the candidates were so carefully trying to map was not just a nutrient-sharing network in this particular ecosystem configuration. It was load-bearing for water transport, ferrying moisture laterally between tree root systems across sections where the direct water table was now inaccessible. When the capillary layer broke, the network had taken on the moisture transport load, and the network was now under a stress load it wasn't designed to carry continuously, and it was beginning to shed connection nodes to protect its core architecture. That was why the canopy was showing 40% stress. The trees weren't thirsty in the simple sense. They were isolated. Their normal lateral moisture relationships were quietly going dark one by one, and the network was too degraded for them to know it yet. I wrote 4 pages that afternoon and most of a fifth. I wrote fast, in the compressed handwriting the notebooks had trained me toward, with the specific notation system I'd developed over years that let me capture spatial relationships between stress events without needing a full map, relative bearing, estimated distance, a symbol set for substrate type and moisture condition and species ID. The species ID was the hardest part in an unfamiliar biome. I had to work from first principles, from growth form and bark texture and leaf architecture and root surface indicators, building a taxonomy I didn't have on the fly and nodding where I was uncertain. I was uncertain on about a third of the species. I flagged every uncertain ID clearly and moved on. By the time the vault's light cycle began its late afternoon fade, I had a working cascade model. It wasn't perfect. I was missing data on 2 of the stress events and my species IDs in the western section were thin. But I had the spine of it. The stream inflow was the origin event, the capillary break was the amplifier, and the mycorrhizal shedding was the active threat. If the shedding continued at its current rate, the network would drop below its functional threshold in roughly 4 to 5 days. And at that point, the canopy level stress would transition from recoverable drawdown to mass dieback. The trial ended on day 6. The network would fail on day 5 or 6. You didn't need to be a certified ecologist to see how that math worked. I found a dry section of ground near the eastern canopy margin, spread my emergency ground sheet, and lay down to think. Intervention was not complicated. It was also not the kind of intervention the Institute's trial methodology had been built around. The trial's framework assumed that candidates would work through the stress events sequentially, documenting each one and proposing targeted interventions that addressed each event as a discrete problem. The interventions were expected to use the Institute's approved material cache, the tools and substrates stored in the permitted equipment area near the entry hatch. I had looked at the permitted equipment area. It contained atmospheric sampling rigs, soil core extractors, water quality probes, species identification arrays, and a collection of substrate amendment materials with detailed application protocols. Good equipment. The right equipment for what the Institute expected candidates to do. It was the wrong equipment for what needed to happen. What needed to happen was not a series of targeted interventions. What needed to happen was an interruption of the cascade before it hit the point of irreversibility. And the way you interrupted this specific cascade, a mycorrhizal network under lateral moisture transport stress, was not by addressing the moisture deficit directly. You couldn't reestablish capillary function from the top down. You had to give the network a reason to stop shedding its connection nodes, which meant reducing the transport load that was causing the shedding, which meant helping the most stressed trees find alternative moisture access before the network made the decision for them. In the Andes, I had done this with earthworks. Small, targeted earthworks, nothing dramatic. A channel diverted here, a check dam built there, a series of basins dug to catch lateral flow and concentrate it over the root zones of the most stressed individuals. You weren't re-engineering the watershed. You were giving the water that was already moving a different path, one that stopped at the places that needed it most. The vault had a stream. The stream had a channel. The stream's channel had banks, and those banks had a gradient, and the gradient was moving water past the eastern root zones and down toward the vault's drainage infrastructure without stopping. I closed my notebook and went to find a digging tool. The permitted equipment area had 2 soil core extractors that could be reconfigured for shallow trenching, and a collection of survey stakes that were rated for substrate penetration up to 60 centimeters. That was enough. I started at about what I estimated was 2 hours before the vault's light cycle would go to night. The stream channel ran roughly north-south across the eastern third of the vault. I needed 4 diversion points, 2 on the western bank to redirect flow toward the most concentrated cluster of stressed root zones, and 2 basins cut into the flood terrace on the eastern bank to catch overflow and let it percolate rather than run on. I dug the first diversion point by feel as much as by any plan. The soil on the stream bank was silty, good, and it compacted well, which meant my diversion structures would hold under flow without needing any reinforcement material. I cut a shallow channel from the bank across the flood terrace at about a 40-degree angle to the stream flow, wide enough to pass a reasonable fraction of the stream's current volume, and lined the cut face of the bank with packed silt to direct flow into the channel rather than letting it spread. The whole thing took about 40 minutes. I was wetter than I would have liked and had mud to the elbow by the time I finished, but the channel was sound. I moved to the second diversion point and started again. Somewhere around the second hour, I became aware that I had an audience. Dale had followed me. He was standing at the stream bank about 30 meters upstream, watching. He didn't say anything when I looked up. He was doing that flat, patient thing again. I went back to digging. By the time the light cycle went to dark, I had completed all 4 diversion points in 2 of the 4 basins. The stream was already moving differently. I could hear it, the subtle change in flow tone when a channel acquires a split and the 2 branches find their different speeds. I could smell it too, the fresh earth smell of moved silt, which was different from the scorched, flat smell of the collapsed biome. This was a working smell. I climbed out of the second basin trench, knocked as much mud off my sleeves as would come off, and sat on the bank for a few minutes listening to the water. Dale came and sat about 5 meters away from me. "You are not observing," he said. "I'm not competing for certification," I said. "I'm allowed to interact with the environment as needed for my own safety. Diverting stream channels is for your safety." Sitting in a biome that hits mass dieback on day 5, while I'm still inside, it seems like a safety concern, yes. Dale was quiet for a moment. In the dark, I couldn't read his expression well. The Vareth had facial musculature that conveyed information on wavelengths my eyes weren't fully calibrated for, and low light made it worse. But his posture had shifted slightly. The subtle forward lean that I had come to understand meant something like engagement. "The network mapping showed the mycorrhizal stress events as discrete," he said. 31 discrete shedding points across the eastern array. Soralim's assessment is that targeted inoculation at the shedding points is the appropriate intervention. How long does that take? For 31 points, with the available substrate amendment materials, approximately 2 days of sustained work. And the cascade threshold is day 5 or 6. Our assessment placed the threshold at day 7, Dale said. Your assessment used the network's current shedding rate as a constant, I said. But the shedding rate accelerates as the network drops below about 60% connectivity. Once it starts shedding load nodes rather than peripheral nodes, the rate increases by an order of magnitude. Your instruments can't distinguish load nodes from peripheral nodes in real time. They're reading connectivity, not function. You're probably already below 70%. Another silence. How do you know the shedding rate accelerates at 60% connectivity? Dale said. It was not quite a question. The inflection was more like someone writing a note to themselves. Coastal scrub die-off in the Pacific fog belt, I said. The mycorrhizal dynamics are different species, different substrate, but the threshold behavior is the same. When a network goes into protective shedding, there's a period of gradual loss and then a period of rapid collapse. The gradual phase looks manageable from the outside until it isn't. I heard him making a sound I didn't have a word for, a low, even tonal thing that I had noticed a few times in seminars and associated with reconsideration. The stream diversions, he said. You believe they will reduce the transport load on the network. Enough to slow the shedding below the acceleration threshold, yes. If the two remaining basins hold, the eastern root zone should have direct soil moisture access within about 12 hours. That's not a cure, but it changes the math. And if the diversions are insufficient, then we still have time to do your inoculation approach as a backup. The approaches aren't exclusive. He made the reconsideration sound again. Why did you not say this to Saralim this morning? He said. I'm not competing for certification, I said again. It's not my call to make. But you saw the cascade this morning, when you checked the topsoil. I had a hypothesis this morning. Hypotheses need more than 40 minutes to become worth arguing about. Dale stood up. In the dark, the gesture read as deliberate, considered rather than reflexive. I will tell Saralim, he said. Tell her the diversions are there. Tell her the stream will hit the eastern root zones by morning. She can assess from there. He moved off through the undergrowth without another word. I sat on the bank for a while longer and listened to the water finding its new way. The night in the vault was not silent. It was never silent in a living biome, even a compromised one. The reduced flow stream made its divided sound. Something moved in the canopy layer. I had logged 3 medium-sized fauna species from track evidence during the afternoon walk, though I hadn't identified them to species. The mycorrhizal network didn't make a sound, of course. But at a certain point in a night in a field site, lying still and not thinking about anything in particular, you develop something that's not quite sound and not quite smell and not quite sensation. A general read on the living system around you. The way you might read the mood of a room from the aggregate of many small signals rather than any single obvious one. The vault felt like it was thinking. That's not a scientific statement, but it was what I had, and I noted it in the margin of my field notebook. Night read, system still integrating, not collapsing, integrating. I slept about 4 hours. By the time the vault's light cycle began its morning ramp, I had completed the remaining 2 basins, walked the full diversion system to check for failure points. One needed minor reinforcement at a bend, easily done, and made a second pass through the canopy zone to check for overnight changes in stress presentation. The presentation had not improved yet. 12 hours was not enough for measurable canopy recovery, but it had not worsened, which at this stage of the cascade was meaningful. When a network is in active shedding, the daily stress signal typically escalates. Flat was better than flat. I noted it and moved on. The other 4 candidates were working the mycorrhizal shedding points when I passed through the central zone around what the light cycle suggested was mid-morning. Saralim had reorganized the work. Velhoth and Thraxis were on inoculation. Dale was on network mapping with a revised methodology that appeared to be cross-referencing surface indicators with soil core data rather than relying solely on the probes. Saralim was coordinating. She stopped what she was doing when I passed. Candidate Dale described your intervention, she said. Ray's audit placement. Candidate Dale described your intervention, she said again, without inflecting it differently, which seemed to be her way of indicating that she was not interested in the correction. The first 2 diversion basins should be showing inflow by now, I said. You might want to check soil moisture readings in the eastern root zone before you allocate your inoculation effort. if the direct moisture access is established. You may not need to hit all 31 shedding points, just the ones where the roots are below the tributary reach. She looked at me for a moment with the slightly lateral focus that I had learned to read as a Verath assessing something outside their immediate category framework. "What is your specialty?" she said. "I'm a field surveyor." "In what discipline?" "Agricultural ecology, degraded land restoration." "That is not a discipline in the Verath Saloon Catalogue." "I know." She held the lateral focus for another moment. Then she told Thraxis to take a soil moisture reading in the eastern zone and went back to her coordination work. Thraxis, the youngest of the four, slight and quick-moving in the way of the younger Verath I'd encountered, who seemed to have a different relationship to physical space than the senior researchers, came back from the eastern zone about 20 minutes later, moving faster than I'd seen any of them move since I arrived. He reported something to Soralim in Rapid Verath that I didn't catch. Soralim turned and looked at me. "The eastern root zone is showing a 40% moisture increase in the first 30 centimeters, she said. "That's faster than I expected," I said. "Good." "The network's shedding rate this morning is below yesterday's reading." "Also good." She waited as if expecting me to say something else. I didn't have anything else to say. "You walked the entire vault yesterday," she said. I needed to understand the full system before I could make sense of any part of it. "In one day." "I've been doing it a long time," I said. "Different environments, but the logic is the same. You read the whole thing first, then you find the thread." "The thread." "The thing that's driving everything else. Usually there's one. Pull that and the rest of the picture gets clearer." She was quiet for a moment. Behind her, Dale was watching again. "The stream inflow reduction," she said. "Mechanical origin, I think. Not ecological, which means once the cascade is arrested, the biome should recover on its own if the inflow is restored. We do not have access to the vault's mechanical systems during the trial." "No, but the cascade arrest should be enough to hold the network through the trial window, if the inoculation work covers the remaining high-risk shedding points." Another pause. "Which shedding points are high risk?" she said. I opened my notebook to the map sketch I'd done the previous afternoon and tore out the page. They spent the rest of the second day finishing the inoculation work on the 12 points I'd flagged as high risk. I spent the rest of the second day walking the vault again, this time with the cascade model mostly confirmed and the remaining variables narrowing. By late afternoon, I had logged 22 of the 14 stress events I'd originally counted, 8 additional ones I'd missed or misread on the first pass, mostly in the canopy layer and mostly lower severity than my first pass estimates, and had a working recovery projection for each one. The projection was this: with the diversions in place and the high-risk inoculation done, the network's shedding rate should fall below the acceleration threshold before the end of day 3. At that point, the biome's own recovery mechanisms would take over for most of the remaining stress events, with the exception of the 3 canopy-level prenecrotic individuals I'd identified in the afternoon. Those needed direct intervention, not because they were load-bearing in the ecosystem sense, but because a necrotic individual in a sealed biome of this density was a disease vector, and the 3 of them were positioned to create a significant secondary stress event if they went fully necrotic before the trial ended. I wrote the intervention proposals in the notebook, then wrote them again on separate pages in a format that looked more like a certification document. Clean, numbered, cross-referenced to the stress event log, and put them in the drop slot of the exit hatch. It was the first time I'd communicated with the monitoring board since entering the vault. I didn't know what they would do with the documents. I was an audit placement. My submissions had no certification standing, but the intervention proposals were time-sensitive, and the candidates needed to know about the prenecrotic individuals if they didn't have them in their own logs, and the easiest way to make sure the information reached everyone was to put it through the official channel. I went back to work on the prenecrotic canopy individuals. Getting up to the first one required about 20 minutes of methodical climbing using a combination of root buttresses, lower branch hooks, and the survey stakes repurposed as holds where the bark was too smooth for purchase. The individual was a large diameter specimen near the canopy's highest point in the eastern third, about 28 meters up. I'd identified it from ground level by the specific way its outer crown had drawn inward, and the faint yellowing at the leaf margins that was only visible from directly below at the right angle. Up close, the diagnosis was clear. The root system's connection to the network had been severed at 3 of the 4 primary junction points. The tree was running on stored reserves, and the reserves were nearly exhausted. The yellowing at the leaf margins was early necrosis, still reversible if the root connection was re-established in the next day or so. Re-establishing root connections from 28 meters up with survey stakes and packed silt was not in any methodology I'd been trained in. But I had the inoculation substrate from the permitted cache. Dale had passed me a portion of it the previous evening without being asked, with the specific batch number notation that told me it was the right formulation for this species type. And I had the core sampler, which at full extension reached about 60 centimeters below whatever surface I was standing on. I packed inoculation substrate into the core sampler, worked it down around the base of the root collar, where the primary junctions had severed, and spent about an hour doing the mechanical work of re-establishing contact between the substrate and the remaining connected root tissue. It was not elegant. It was not what a credentialed ecologist with proper equipment would do, but it was what I had, and I had 18 years of doing what I had in conditions where what I had was not what the methodology assumed. When I came back down, Thraxus was waiting at the base of the tree. "Velhoff said you went up," he said. "Prenecrotic individual, root junction failure. I've submitted the others to the board through the drop slot. There are 2 more at similar stage in the western canopy." He looked up at the tree, then at me, then at the core sampler in my hand. "You are not certified for aerial intervention," he said. "I'm not certified for anything here," I said. "I'm observing." He made a sound that I hadn't heard from any of the others, short, not quite tonal, somewhere between acknowledgement and something I didn't have a word for. I wrote it down when I got a chance. Thraxus subvocal on downward confirmation. Context: human sighting audit status after obvious aerial work. Read: possibly the equivalent of a suppressed laugh. Uncertain. By the morning of the 3rd day, the monitoring board had evidently made a decision. I knew this because Korathseln's voice came through the vault's emergency communication channel, a one-way broadcast system that the board could use for safety communications during the trial, and said, in the careful formal Verath that she had used during our intake meeting, that the board wished to communicate that my submitted documentation was being logged in the trial record as advisory observation materials, and that the board noted my ongoing environmental interaction activities, and that the board wished to clarify that audit placement participants were permitted to interact with the biome environment as needed for their personal safety. She paused after that, the way she had paused in the intake meeting. "The board also wishes to note," she said, "that your submitted recovery projections have been reviewed by 2 members of the certification panel, and that the panel members have no substantive methodological objections to the projections." She paused again. "That is the complete board communication," she said. I noted it in the margin, day 3 a.m., board comms. No substantive methodological objections is Verath administrative language for something. Look it up. I found out later, in conversation with another institute researcher who had been at Verath Salyun for several years, that no substantive methodological objections was the closest the certification panel's formal language came to endorsement. The panel was not structured to endorse work that hadn't been submitted through the standard certification channel. But no objections was a finding, and a finding went into the record, and a finding in the record had weight. I didn't know any of that in the vault. I just noted it and went back to the western canopy to find the second prenecrotic individual. The cascade broke on day 3, late afternoon by the vault's light cycle. I knew it before any instrument reading could have confirmed it because the smell of the biome changed. The scorched, mineral note of the collapsed microbiome gave way, not to the fresh earth smell of the working silt, which was still present, but to something older and more complex. The layered smell of an active soil system, the specific organic depth that comes when the microbial community starts rebuilding from the reserve population in the lower substrate. I sat down on a root buttress and wrote in the notebook for a while. The canopy stress presentation was visibly reduced when I looked up. Not resolved, the trees would need weeks to fully recover their lateral network connections, and the stream inflow issue was still an unaddressed mechanical problem. But the presentation had dropped from 40% to something closer to 20%, and the 20% that remained were mostly the prenecrotic individuals I'd already documented, and the weakest members of the outer canopy that would have been lost in any cascade recovery scenario. The network had stopped shedding. I wrote that down, day 3, late afternoon. Cascade arrest confirmed by olfactory read. Canopy stress presentation approximately 20%. Network shedding halted. Then I wrote the full recovery field log. Not the field notes. Those were spread across 32 pages of the notebook at that point, dense with sketches and notation, and numbered stress event codes and spatial references. The recovery field log was a different document, clean, structured, written for the record. Each stress event identified, described, and classified by severity. Each cascade relationship documented and explained. Each intervention described with materials used and estimated time to stable outcome. Each remaining unresolved event flagged with a priority level and a recommended next action. I wrote it in 3 drafts. The first draft took most of the remaining afternoon. The second draft was tighter. I found about a third of the content in the first draft that was internal to my thinking process rather than informative to anyone reading the record, and I cut it. The third draft was clean enough. 28 pages. I numbered them, confirmed the page order, and bound them with 2 survey stakes through a punched corner hole. I ate my dinner, field rations from my pack, a habit I'd never quite broken of packing more than the briefing materials told me was necessary, and lay on the ground sheet and looked up at the canopy. The canopy had a different quality than it had on the first day. The overholding was gone from the trees I'd targeted. The outer growth had relaxed back to its normal extension, the individual crowns resuming their lateral reach. In a mature secondary forest ecosystem, the canopy was essentially the top face of a system that ran from root to sky. You could read the whole system's health from the canopy if you knew what you were looking for, and what I was looking at now was a system that was tired but not dying. I wrote one more note. Recovery projection updated. System stable through trial close. Western Canopy Individual 3 requires follow-up inoculation on day 5 if available. Inflow restoration recommended at earliest opportunity post-trial. Then I slept for 5 hours, which was more than I usually allowed myself in the field. I submitted the recovery field log through the drop slot at approximately the 2nd hour of the vault's morning light cycle on day 4, my day 3, the trial's day 4. I had calculated, before I put it in the slot, that this was approximately 36 hours before what my original cascade model had identified as the network's failure threshold, and approximately 48 hours before the monitoring board's instrument-based assessment had put that threshold. By the trial's own timeline, I was submitting a complete recovery log roughly 2 days before the trial expected any candidate to be in a position to submit one. I was also, of course, not a candidate. I folded the bound log, slid it through the slot, and sat down on the ground near the hatch. I had a second field ration in my pack, the kind with the foil pouch that held up well even when you'd been sweating for 3 days in a sealed biome, and I ate it slowly, watching the morning light cycle bring the vault's canopy up from deep gray through green-gray into the particular quality of vault light that approximated late morning. Through the observation glass above the hatch, I could see the monitoring station. I had been aware of the observation glass throughout the trial, in the peripheral way that you're aware of things in the field that are outside your immediate working zone, but that you're tracking anyway. The board had been continuously present behind the glass. The Verath monitoring teams worked in shift rotations during trials, and I had noted at various points over the previous 3 days that the shift composition changed, but the number of figures behind the glass rarely dropped below 6. There were 11 of them now. That was new. I had not counted 11 at any point in the previous 3 days. I noted it without making a production of it. 11 was more than a standard shift. 11 suggested that someone had called additional board members to the observation station. I kept eating. About 20 minutes after I submitted the log, Korath Seln's voice came through the emergency channel again. "The monitoring board has received your submitted documentation," she said. "The board is conducting a review. Please remain accessible in the vicinity of the entry hatch." I was sitting directly in front of the entry hatch, eating a foil pouch ration. "Understood," I said. The channel went quiet. The 11 figures behind the glass were doing something with documents and instrument panels that I couldn't read in detail through the observation glass. I watched them the way I'd watch a canopy I was trying to read, not focused on any individual element, but letting the aggregate pattern come in. What the aggregate pattern told me was that the board was in the phase that field researchers called working a surprise. Not a bad surprise, not necessarily a good surprise, just a finding that didn't fit the expected shape of things, and that required the team to stop what they were doing and collectively decide what the finding meant. I finished my ration, folded the foil pouch and put it in my pack. Soralim appeared from the undergrowth about an hour after the board communication. She sat down on the route across from the hatch without being asked, which was a shift from her previous approach to my company. "You submitted the full log this morning," she said. "Yes." "The network assessment section. Is that what they're reviewing?" "Among other things." She paused. "The network assessment methodology in your log is not a recognized methodology in the Institute's catalog. It's a field methodology, observational, no proprietary instrument requirements." "No instrument requirements," she said. She said it the way Dale had said, "You have soil on your fingers" on the first day, the tone of someone writing something down in a place they'd be able to find again. I read the network state from the canopy presentation and the soil moisture gradient and the olfactory indicators, I said, cross-referenced against the stream diversion response and the inoculation uptake timing. The methodology isn't complicated. It's just slow, and it requires the practitioner to have spent enough time in degraded field environments to have the reference library built up. How long does that take, to build the reference library? For me, about 8 years before I trusted it. Another 6 or 7 before it became reliable on unfamiliar substrate. She sat with that for a moment. "You have been doing this for 18 years, she said. "Yes." "The Institute's Tier 3 certification requires 6 years of documented instrument-based fieldwork." "I know. You do not have documented instrument-based fieldwork." "I have field notebooks." She was quiet for a long time, long enough that I watched the canopy complete about a third of its morning light response cycle. The slow, almost imperceptible tracking of leaf angles toward the vault's overhead light source that happens in a healthy canopy when the stomatal exchange opens up for the day. "The canopy is better," she said. "Yes. That you saw it from the first day." "From the entry airlock, yes. The ethylene signal was present before the inner seal cycled. Before you could see anything. The smell is faster than the visual. In a compromised biome, by the time you can see the stress in the canopy, you've already lost about a week of response time." She leaned forward slightly, the engagement posture. "That is the thing they don't teach," she said. "It's hard to teach. You have to smell enough sick biomes that the healthy smell becomes precise enough to read." "How many sick biomes have you been in?" I thought about it. The Atacama Fringe sites, maybe a dozen over 3 seasons. The Andes Seed Bank surveys, which ran through degraded transitional zones as a matter of route. The Pacific Coastal Strip, 2 full seasons. The 3 emergency surveys I'd done for the Restoration Cooperative in the worst years, when the die-off fronts were moving fast enough that the cooperatives were deploying anyone they could get to the front edge. The small-scale stuff in between. "Enough," I said. She nodded, which I had learned was not a Verath gesture. She had picked it up somewhere, possibly from institute researchers who'd worked with human colleagues before. "The board is going to have questions," she said. "I know. You do not hold standing to answer them formally. The audit placement." "I know. But they will have questions." "I'll answer what I can," I said. She stood up and looked at me for a moment with the lateral focus. "You read the whole vault," she said, "in one day." "I walked it. It's different from reading." "Is it?" I thought about how to answer that. In the field notebooks, there was a version of the answer that ran to several pages. The distinction between gathering data and building a picture, between instrument readings and pattern recognition, between understanding a system through its measurements and understanding it through its behavior. Every experienced field researcher I'd ever worked with had their own version of the same distinction. Most of them had trouble explaining it to people who hadn't spent enough time in the field to have built the reference library. "Walk it enough times," I said, "and eventually the walking and the reading are the same thing." She left. The board session ran for approximately 3 hours, based on the activity I could observe through the glass. At the end of it, Korath Seln's voice came through the channel a 3rd time. "The monitoring board has completed its review of the submitted documentation," she said. "The board finds the submitted recovery field log methodologically sound and consistent with the observable vault data. The board has designated the submission as concurrent recovery documentation, advisory classification, and it will be appended to the trial record." A pause. "The board additionally notes that the submitted documentation describes a complete resolution of 16 of the 22 identified stress events, with ongoing monitoring recommendations for the remaining 6. The board notes that this outcome, if confirmed by close-of-trial assessment, would represent the earliest complete resolution submission in the trial's recorded history." Another pause. "The board is scheduling a methodology review session for after the trial closes. Attendance by all vault participants, including audit placement participants, is requested." The channel closed. I looked through the observation glass. Several of the figures had changed posture. There were Verath postures I still couldn't read with precision, but the aggregate energy of the group had shifted from the working a surprise mode to something else. Something more settled. The kind of shift a monitoring team makes when a surprise resolves into a finding and the finding turns out to have weight. I picked up my field notebook, checked the page count, 34 pages, which was about 4 pages short of the longest notebook entry I'd ever completed in a single field deployment, and wrote one more line at the bottom of the last page. "Day 3 my count, Day 4 trial count, board review complete, log accepted, sitting by the hatch." I closed the notebook and put it in my vest pocket. The other 4 candidates came out of the undergrowth over the next 2 hours, one at a time or in pairs, finishing the last of the inoculation work on the remaining high-priority shedding points. Thraxus came last, and he sat down about 3 meters from me for a while without saying anything, the way Dale had sat on the stream bank 2 nights before. "The Western Individual 3, he said. "The pre-necrotic one in the Western Canopy. Root collar inoculation, same as the first 2. It should be in the log. I did it this morning, before you submitted." "How did it take?" "The substrate contact looked good. I'll check tonight." "You'll want to check the secondary root system, not just the collar. The junction failure on that one went deeper." He made the subvocal sound I had noted the previous day, the possible suppressed laugh. I looked. "Good," I said. We sat there for a while. The vault's light cycle was moving toward mid-afternoon. The canopy's tracking had reached its midday position, the maximum stomatolopen angle, all the surviving crowns turned toward the overhead light, the full collective surface area of the forest running its daily transaction with the energy coming in. It was a good canopy, tired, stressed, thinned by what the cascade had taken from it, but good. A canopy that was going to be standing in a week and a month and a year if the inflow got fixed. Velhoth walked past on her way to the stream, stopped, and looked at the 2 of us sitting by the hatch. "You could go," she said to me. "The hatch is accessible. The documentation is submitted." "I know," I said. "You are waiting for something." I thought about it. "Lunch," I said. She made a sound I hadn't heard from her before. Not the reconsideration tone, not the working a surprise mode. Something lighter. She went to check the stream. I ate the last field ration in my pack. A different formulation from the mornings. The kind with the dry grain component I'd always liked better than the paste version, and sat with my back against the hatch housing and looked at the vault. The methodology review session would be after the trial closed. That was 2 more days. The candidates still had work to do, refining their documentation, completing the final recovery assessments, writing up the formal certification submissions. My presence in the session was requested, which in Verath administrative language was 1 step below required and several steps above optional. I had questions of my own, though I hadn't said so. The question that had been sitting in the back of my field notebook since the morning of the first day, the one I'd written in the margin next to the initial cascade assessment and circled twice. What classified as fieldwork here? Not the credential question. I had lived without credentials long enough that it had stopped being a source of friction. The actual question, how did you translate 18 years of walking in sick landscapes into a form that could be assessed and transmitted and built on by people who'd spent those 18 years doing something else? Because the field notebooks didn't do it. The notebooks captured what I'd seen and measured and concluded, but they didn't capture the thing underneath, the texture of repeated experience, the reference library that let the smell of the entry airlock tell you what the canopy would look like before you could see it. That was the thing the Institute's methodology hadn't anticipated. Not because they'd missed it, but because it was genuinely hard to anticipate. You couldn't build a certification standard around a skill that required 20 years to develop and couldn't be measured with instruments. But you could build a curriculum around it. That was different. I wrote that in the notebook, curriculum angle, not certification documentation. Build the reference library protocol. What does a degraded biome smell apprenticeship look like? And put the notebook away. The vault's light was going amber toward evening. Through the observation glass, the board had reduced to a standard shift. The session notes from the methodology review would come through the formal channel when they were ready. I stood up, stretched my back. 3 days of field work in a sealed biome was not harder than 3 days of field work in the field. But the positions I'd held during the earthworks had reminded me that 43 was not 25, and checked the hatch mechanism. It was unlocked. It had been unlocked all day. I opened it, stepped through the inner seal, and let the airlock cycle. On the other side, in the staging corridor, there were two members of the board I hadn't seen before, senior researchers, based on the credential markings, though I couldn't read the full Verath rank notation yet. They had the posture of people who had planned to be somewhere else and had been redirected. Behind them, a junior administrative staff member was holding a document folder and looking slightly unprepared. I nodded to them. "Tomas raised," I said, "audit placement." The senior researcher on the left, tall, older-looking, the secondary limbs in a posture I hadn't seen before and couldn't read, looked at me for a moment with the lateral focus. "We know," she said. I walked past them to the staging corridor's washroom, because 3 days of earthworks and canopy climbing had left their mark and I had priorities. Behind me, I heard the junior administrative staff member say something to the senior researcher in rapid Verath. The senior researcher answered, and whatever she said, the junior staff member's posture shifted into the mode I recognized from my own intake process. The careful documentation mode, the one that meant someone was going to need a new category. I washed the last of the vault mud off my hands and went to find water that wasn't a field ration. The methodology review session was 4 days after the trial closed. I was the first one there, which surprised the board liaison who came to unlock the room. It was a seminar room, not a lecture theater. Round table, which I appreciated. 8 chairs, which meant the board had invited all 4 candidates as well as 2 additional researchers I hadn't met. Korath Seln opened the session. She had a document in front of her that I recognized as a copy of my recovery field log, the 28 pages, the numbered stress events, the cascade analysis. "The purpose of this session," she said, "is to review the methodology documented in the advisory submission and to determine whether any components of that methodology are appropriate for integration into the Institute's field research curriculum." She looked around the table. "We will begin with the olfactory assessment protocol," she said. "Researcher Reyes, as the methodology's author, would you be willing to describe its development?" I thought about the notebooks, all 17 of them, the handwriting getting smaller as the pages got used up. The Atacama Fringe in the bad years, the Pacific Coastal Strip, the emergency surveys. 23 years, if you counted the years before the 18 I usually cited, the first surveys I'd done as a junior researcher, the ones that didn't make it into the formal record because they'd been contract work for entities that no longer existed. I thought about how to say something true in a room that had a methodology catalog and a credential taxonomy, and had, as of 4 days ago, added a new notation to that taxonomy to account for a category of work it hadn't expected to find inside one of its own sealed vaults. "It starts with sick biomes," I said. "You have to have a reference for what healthy smells like before a sick one tells you anything. So first you need a lot of healthy, and then you need a lot of sick, and then you need a long time between the two, long enough that the reference library builds up to the point where the gap between healthy and sick registers before you have to think about it." I looked around the table. Dale had his flat patient attention on. Thraxus had his notebook out. Soralim was in the careful documentation mode. "How long?" Korath Seln said. "For me, 8 years before I trusted the read. 14 before it became a primary diagnostic tool rather than a secondary check." A silence. "The Institute's Tier 3 trial is 6 days, she said. "Yes. And the first stage olfactory read, as described in your log, was completed before you entered the vault. In the entry airlock, yes, before the inner seal cycled." Another silence. "We will need to discuss curriculum structure," she said. "I know," I said. "I have some thoughts about that." I put my notebook on the table. Outside, through the seminar room's observation window, The propagation laboratory's lights were running at mid-morning intensity. Somewhere behind that wall, inside Vault 3, the canopy was doing what it had been doing for the last 4 days, turning slowly back toward the light, extending its lateral reach into the space the cascade had vacated, rebuilding the quiet lateral network of relationships that kept a forest standing through everything the environment could direct against it. I hadn't been in there since the trial closed, but I knew what it smelled like by now. I knew the specific quality of the air that came off a recovering biome in the early stages, the thin but present note of functional soil, the first green traces of the resuming mycorrhizal exchange. I would have said it smelled like work well done, except that wasn't precise enough for a methodology document. I wrote it down anyway. Some things belong in the margin.